Welcome to another short lecture video on unemployment and labor market. So today we want to discuss a little bit about labor markets and some of the indicators that the economists use to assess the health of labor markets. And one of the most important things is the notion of unemployment. So how is unemployment measured? Why is it significant? What is the relationship between unemployment and economic growth, or the health of the economy, productivity, and production, and discuss what are the different types of unemployment, this notion of natural rate of unemployment, and so on. So let's start by reviewing some of the basic definitions associated with the labor market. Okay, so essentially this is going to put people in the labor market in different categories or bags. They're relatively simple. If you have a job, you're called employed. If you don't have a job, but you are actively looking for a job and you're available to work, then you are considered unemployed. And then the labor force is essentially composed by those employed and unemployed. So it's everybody who wants to work, those who have found a job, the employed, those who couldn't find a job but are actively looking for one, the unemployed. There's also people who, even though they are within the age of working, are not interested in looking for a job. Maybe they're taking some time off, or maybe they're injured, or whatever is going on. Those people are not in the labor force. The unemployment rate essentially measures what percentage of the labor force is unemployed. So it gives you a notion of, if you pick a person who would like to be working at random, what is the likelihood or probability that person hasn't been able to find a job? And so obviously the higher the unemployment rate, the more difficult it is to find jobs in an economy. Another indicator or labor market statistic that is often relevant is to look at the labor force participation rate. So this essentially looks at the economically active population, essentially those who are 16 years of age or older, what fraction of those people is actually in the labor force. And that gives us a notion of how many people are also staying at home. So labor force participation, for example, changed abruptly during the 1970s and 80s, where a lot of women started to join the labor force. The women used to choose to stay at home and engage in household production, so stay out of the formal labor market. And then starting in the 70s, 80s, a lot of women joined the labor force. That would lead to an increase in the labor force participation rate. Now, these are the formulas, both for labor force participation, essentially is the ratio between the labor force and the economically active population, and unemployment is essentially the number of unemployed workers divided by the labor force. Now, we will see the unemployment rate, even though it gives us a measure or a notion of how difficult it is to find a job, it can have some limitations. And on the one hand, it can overstate the true level of unemployment. In other words, it can give us a number that is too high, because even in a very healthy labor environment where people can find a job and there are jobs available, the search for a job is a process that naturally is time consuming. Why? Because you essentially have to go to a bunch of interviews, and this is what economists call a search process. So you got to go through a bunch of different interviews and so on, acquire information from the market about what are the opportunities available out there. Similarly, employers have to interview a bunch of candidates. It takes time, it takes money, and so on. And so those people, while they're searching for a job, they will show up as unemployed, even though it's only, in some sense, the fact that it takes time to find a job what's showing up there, not the fact that there are no jobs. So in some sense, it's the notion of unemployment can be polluted by that fact. Another way in which the unemployment can be misleading is can understate the notion of unemployment. So assume you have an economy that has been going through a deep economic downturn or economic recession. And initially, people lose their jobs. They start looking for jobs. They can't find one job. While they're looking for jobs and they can't find one, they will see the unemployment increase. Because more people are out of jobs, more people are searching, they can find one. If that recession extends over a long period of time, what may happen is people after 1 year, 1 year and a half, 2 years of looking for jobs, if they cannot find one, they may conclude there is no job available, and then they may stop searching for jobs. And when they stop searching for jobs, they go from being unemployed to being out of the labor force, which can lead to a decrease in the unemployment rate. Because now there's there's a higher fraction of the people looking for jobs who can find a job, but that's simply telling you. So even though the labor market is very is kind of in bad shape and it's difficult to find a job, that is reflected with a reduction in unemployment. So long-term unemployment may actually lead to reduction in the unemployment rate if it leads to people leaving the labor force. So that's why also you have to look at what's going on with labor force participation and other indicators to give you a more general idea of what's going on in the labor market and not just look at unemployment rate. Now, in order to avoid that second problem we discussed, sometimes you may want to look at more broader categories. Some other notions are what we call discouraged workers, people who have given up looking for work recently, and you may want to include those in your notion of unemployment. There's another one called marginally attached workers, those who are available and look for work but not recently. So those are essentially the ones who just left the labor force. Or you can look at underemployed workers, people who have part-time jobs, not because they want to, but because they can't find a full-time job. They will show up as employed, but you may want to think of those people as part of the unemployment problem. So these are ways in which we can, by looking at these different categories, we can give you a more rich description of what's going on with the labor statistics and the labor market. So to summarize, how good of an indicator is the unemployment rate? It is imperfect. It doesn't measure the quality of the jobs, and it may be subject to some of the criticism that we discussed a moment ago, and that's why it's important to look at broader or other indicators such as labor force participation, the number of full-time jobs, what's going on with wages, etc., etc.